Hi, this is Uha Kafe and Petra Luchimukova. We are back after a long break and happy to have a special guest in our studio today. Let me welcome Jay Fisk, Professor of Aging and Digital Health at the Center of Computing and Social Responsibility, De Montfort University, Leicester, United Kingdom. Currently a visiting professor at the Philosophical Faculty at the Institute of Social Work. Thank you for accepting my invitation, Malcolm.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you very much. You're an expert on digital health, a wide field covering issues such as telehealth, telemedicine, or telecare. For many of our listeners, it can be difficult to imagine what it actually is. What is digital health and why should we care?
Well, there's two questions there, very important questions. With regard to what digital health is, many people will be familiar with ideas around the changing relationship that we as ordinary citizens have with our medical, our healthcare services and the technologies that are used within those services. So when we come to definitions of digital health, they tend to be rather top-down, based on what the clinicians would like in order to be able to gather information about us, our bodies and our health, in order to make diagnoses and treatments in accordance with the information that they gather. And this captures within the umbrella term digital health what is recognized as telemedicine. That's very much at the clinical end of things, but also telecare, which is at the social end of things. And the word telehealth brings all of these actually together. So very often you'll find the term telehealth used instead of digital health and vice versa. But the important thing to remember is that they are comprehensive terms, both of them, that capture a whole range of things around our clinical health and our broader well-being. Why should we care? Well, we should care because, and we may come on to this, that the range of technologies that are employed within the services provided under that umbrella term are increasingly gathering more and more of our personal data, and a lot of the technologies are now more and more accessible to us. So our relationships with the providers of health services are definitely changing and will continue to change very rapidly, perhaps, over the next decade.
It's very clear that this field is and requires an interdisciplinary outlook and cooperation. It is concerned with the technological, medical and social aspects, as you said, related to the development of healthcare, or generally speaking, quality of life, if I may say. Among others, I should mention progressive and telescope, interdisciplinary European Commission funded projects you led. What is the key to a successful interdisciplinary cooperation? This is a challenge to many of us.
Well, it most certainly is a challenge because we've tended to become accustomed to working within particular silos that relate to our professional interests. And so very often the notion of interdisciplinarity works against the established norms, if you like, of practice, both in academia and, of course, in the wider world as well. So with regard to the secret of effective collaboration, well, we can only go so far, I think, as long as there's a lot of defensiveness on the part of professional associations, and insofar as we still have structures that preclude, to some extent, interdisciplinary working. But the first thing is to bring people together from different backgrounds and to try with them to unpick some of the belief systems and traditions that relate to their work and see how valid they are in the present context, in our new, very internationalized world, in our data-rich world as well. And because these changes that have been taking place over the last 3 and more decades really undermine sometimes the prevailing, if you like, ethos of some of the existing services that we provided, and which perhaps go back or date back to several decades to perhaps the Second World War, when there was this new, obviously, aspiration to bring in a wider range of good health services and social welfare services as well.
So is it more about communication, developing communication skills of the academics?
Well, it is to some extent, yes. I mean, because what I suggested just then was about unpicking some of the bases of how people think and what they do. But you've also got to put in place some new kind of vision and try to get people to buy into that new vision so that whatever their background, they can actually see a different way of working and they can see what needs to change, both in terms of the ways of thinking of their professions, but also in terms of the changes that may be needed to the training that's given to people who are entering those professions, or indeed the people who are already practicing in those professions, both at a senior level or a practitioner level as well. Now, with regard to the Progressive and the Telescope projects, Telescope was instrumental in rethinking ideas around telehealth services, turning them from rather top-down services where providers and suppliers of technologies were kind of dictating the form and shape of those services based on particular kinds of technologies, to rethinking things from the user, the patient, the person, the citizen perspective.
Could you perhaps describe this bit, the goal of this project, as so that we can all imagine what was?
Indeed. Well, the goal was to develop a European code of practice for telehealth services. And clearly that code of practice was all to do with the ethos of the service and the way in which the services operated, escaping from that top-down perspective to a rather different perspective. So instead of talking about how services or technologies were delivered to people, which is very much a clinical way of talking, the delivery of health services, for instance, to actually talking about the provision of services on a rather different basis. So the notion of provision allows for a partnership approach between citizens and these service providers. More than that, it's also turning around our thinking about those services to ones which actually ask the question as to how people, how citizens can access services in new kinds of ways, especially bearing in mind that we now have an increasing variety of technological tools which are accessible, usable and affordable to many people, whether it's the smart home or laptop computers, all these kind of things, wearable devices, lower cost devices that people can now use and which are potentially empowering to them. And let me add, we may discuss it a bit more later, that voice assistants like Alexa are important here as well, because they represent a new way of interacting with our technological systems, which may be of help to us with regard to our health and well-being and the way we access different kinds of services. And let me just mention one more thing about the Progressive project as well, because that was looking, or that involved, by the way, 4 standards bodies within the European Union. And that was great. We were looking at standards in the area of ICT, information and communications technologies, for older people. And we were trying to get standards bodies to think more broadly about what was needed, not just in relation to people's health, but in relation to their broader well-being. And that broader well-being included things like employment opportunities, leisure opportunities, political engagement, all these different kinds of things that are important to a fulfilling life, and not to subscribe to any notions that are sometimes prevalent around older people being defined by health or by chronology of their age, which obviously is not meaningful in relation to people's health and well-being and engagement.
It is a shift. We can see a shift from, let's say, focus on what the professionals in the public healthcare system need, to more patient or client-centered approach. That's what you were dealing with.
Well, most definitely, yes. I mean, I would also be wary of the word patient even now, because patient tends to be used clearly for people in institutional settings, whether they're in hospital or in the clinic or in the doctor's surgery. But because so much of the services that people access or want to access to help them with their health and well-being are available in people's own homes, then what we don't want to see is a decentralization of some of the institutional norms that we have in hospital, using technologies that may be appropriate in the hospital, but may not be appropriate in your own home. We need to see that kind of thinking avoided, so that people will be motivated, I hope, and assisted, guided to acquire, buy, use technologies that are right for them in their own home, and actually give them more control over their personal care, their personal health, rather than become subjects of, if you like, clinical stroke technological ways of doing things that have been characteristic of the past.
So there is a sort of respect towards the environment that the person is inhabiting, in fact.
Very much so. And one of the issues, of course, when it comes to digital health and the technologies that are part of digital health systems is the way that personal data is being gathered and used. And what it means is that very often clinicians and others may become trapped within an operational framework where they are looking for data, using that data, and using perhaps some artificial intelligence, machine learning to help with diagnoses and the treatments, determining the treatments that people may need. And that is possibly distracting from the attention that they are giving to the individual, their life circumstances and so forth. In fact, it is leading to the assessment of particular conditions or the analysis of different service options in terms of treatment options. It is leading to those being determined by the computerized programs and technologies, rather than taking account of the wider issues, social determinants, if you like, that might relate to somebody's lifestyle, their poverty, their poor housing, or whatever it may be.
So it is a shift towards less reductive and to more contextualized care, let's say.
Well, we need to avoid a shift towards a kind of functional approach based on data. We need to avoid that going too far. Now, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of good things about the technologies and the way they can help with diagnoses and treatments and things like this, but we mustn't totally detach that. Well, maybe we will in certain circumstances in a hospital setting, but certainly when it comes to the home, then there's a much wider variety of factors, including family factors and environmental factors, that need to be taken into account, and mean that there's still going to be an important role for community health service workers, including GPs, to determine what is best and to understand more about the individual and their circumstances with whom they're dealing, and obviously use the technologies to help guide them in the decisions that they make, rather than becoming subservient to the analysis that's done by those technologies.
Digital health is obviously a very practically oriented discipline, concerned primarily with the applied dimension, oriented towards enhancing well-being, as you describe it. What makes it particularly interesting for me as a sociologist is this concern with technological advancement combined with the focus on marginalized groups, let's say disadvantaged people, elderly people, etc. Is that one of the drivers of yours?
It is a very strong driver of mine, and also a strong concern of mine, that in our digital world that we may actually lead to more disadvantaged people losing out. Now, many people who are very perhaps positive about the commercial agendas and government agendas about what technologies can do in the area of health, particularly clinical health, may be overlooking the fact that simply extending access to online services, for instance, is going to be empowering to people. What we need to do is, yes, indeed, let's develop those options for people. Let's extend the networks to every nook and cranny of the Czech Republic or the UK or wherever, in order for more and more people, even in rural and remote areas, to have access. But let's make sure that that access is easy, is affordable as well, so it can be used. One of the problems is, and it's a problem that's tended to be overlooked, is that many manufacturers are developing technologies which clearly do respond to the clinical agendas, but which are not user-friendly. Even ordinary computer interfaces keep changing because you have updated software and things like this.
Can be challenging for young people. I imagine that for elderly people, this is sometimes a very huge step that they need to take.
Indeed. That's why I mentioned voice assistants like Alexa earlier. Very, very simple interface. And don't let's assume, by the way, that older people are technology averse. They, on the whole, are not technology averse. It's simply the fact that they haven't worked very often in technology-rich environments. I'm fond of saying very often, if I'm talking with an older person in their home, and they may say, "Oh, we're not keen on these new technologies," I'm fond of saying, "Well, what is that on your armchair?" And this is the television remote control. Now, the television remote control is a very sophisticated piece of gadgetry, bit of technology. It may have 48 buttons on it, and you only use 9 of them or something, or 4 of them. But nevertheless, it shows that where technology works for somebody, they will use it. Likewise with Alexa, they will use it. There are some concerns I have about privacy and the data use as well, which perhaps we'll touch on. But nevertheless, there is a big issue about design of those interfaces, and also even the control of those interfaces, so that they're not designed in a way that is automatically going to gather data about people's well-being or their movement or activity within the dwelling. But actually there's an on-off switch which allows people to control the extent of their privacy, and maybe later in years, if they have particular problems, even increase their openness to their data being collected. For instance, if you have a visual impairment and you know you're going to be at greater risk. So that's a very good reason why you would want to share certain information in order for a response to be obtained if there's something adverse happened to you. Likewise, if someone has degrees of dementia, then clearly there's extra vulnerability, and they might, even before they enter into the later stages of dementia, they might agree to having a higher level of surveillance than otherwise would be the case. But the point there is that people should be given control over that. It shouldn't be assumed by the clinicians that, yes, we can gather all this information, regardless almost of the consent and the choices of the individual about their own privacy and their particular lifestyles.
But this requires a lot of education as well.
It does require education. It needs more awareness than education. And we did ask the question about disadvantage initially, and I haven't properly answered that. But my fear is fundamentally that even though we extend the networks, we do need to tackle that issue of design and the usability of interfaces. And that, if we do take that second one on board, and the point you just made there, Petra, about people being informed and knowledgeable, then it's conceivable that we could reduce some of the disadvantage in terms of access to health services. But it doesn't necessarily put any more money into the pockets of people who may be poor. It doesn't improve their houses if they live in bad conditions, which are affecting their respiratory conditions and so forth. And it doesn't necessarily improve their opportunity to stay in or re-engage with the world of work.
But that's why you probably need a cooperation with another department, right? With social work, social care.
Yes, social care. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. You do need collaboration there. I can see that we should have collaboration. You're right, with people who are perhaps working within the social care field, within the health field. Also, we need collaboration with people who are very much technology-driven. And there's some good innovation going on by the technologists, that's fine. But the people very often are missing from the equation. And when I mentioned their employment and training, let's not rule older people out of the equation here, because there are more and more older people wanting to stay and work, and yet they are very often kind of pushed out. And at the same time, you've got some people talk about this tsunami or this increase in numbers of vulnerable older people. There is an increase in the numbers of vulnerable older people because they are living longer and hopefully healthier lives. The problem is a political one because it's because people tend to retire at a younger age, or they are made to retire at a younger age. And yet,
are they in Britain?
Well, I mean, you've got more flexibility in Britain now to work for longer. But nevertheless, there's this kind of notion that once you get to a certain age, you retire. And with that comes the thinking that goes something like this. Well, if someone's retired, they are no longer contributing to the economy, they are of lesser worth, and all kinds of ageist notions come into people's thinking in that kind of context. And by removing the retirement age and encouraging people to work for longer, if they can, even on a part-time or flexible basis, then that increases people's motivation. It very often increases their health and their morale and so forth in a way that reduces the demand on health services. So the notion that we have a huge increase in demand for our health services is really people talking about, well, it's going to be a huge increase in cost. It's not a huge increase in cost if you have creative jobs and employment for more older people who are willing to stay in the workforce to an older age and who are less likely, therefore, to draw on the public funds that might be needed to help them to manage any health conditions that they have. And just one other point, by the way. Clearly, there are some people who work in some jobs who are probably not capable of or to work in the particular areas of employment into their older age. You know, there's some heavy jobs that many men and women do, where that would be not possible. But there's still opportunities for retraining and changing work that people do, even if they have suffered the consequences of heavy labour during their working lives.
Do you see a real impact of these technologies or these services on people's life? Can you see that? Because it seems to me you propose a bottom-up approach, so you probably are very much in touch with the people of need. So how does the real impact look like? What's the real result of your work?
Yeah, the problem is that still thinking is fairly narrow. Even though digital health, telehealth has gained momentum, and it's been given extra momentum, by the way, because of the COVID pandemic, nevertheless, the changed thinking within the professional groups has been slow to come about, because people feel secure in what they are doing, or what they were doing before the pandemic. And it's only something like the pandemic, for all its negative, very, very bad things, it's only something of that critical nature that is going to force people or make them think, well, are there other ways that we can do things that might be better? Give people more choices, enable them to stay at home or to develop and maintain the lifestyles that they want. And I've forgotten the original question there.
How do you observe the real impact of your work on everyday people's life?
Well, it is actually the extent to which people are engaging in new ways. And actually, with regard to COVID, clearly one thing that changed very dramatically is the fact that people have increasingly consulted with the GP or with the hospital outpatient appointments using the telephone, or indeed online. You're absolutely right. And this has helped many older people and younger people as well to, if you like, manage their health needs in more flexible kinds of ways.
Quicker, perhaps?
Sorry?
Quicker.
Well, sometimes quicker, yes, indeed. Because it has reduced the number of face-to-face appointments, of course, that are being made in hospitals or in local community settings with GPs. The problem is, of course, that the overall demand for other kinds of operations and diagnoses and treatments and tests and so forth have increased during the pandemic. So the overall health services are not seeing any benefit from that just yet. And there is a great deal of uncertainty now, of course, about the role of the general practitioner, the GP, because of this new way of consulting with patients coming in. Now, that obviously has increased to a relatively, remote consultations have increased to quite a high level with the COVID pandemic, but that will settle back to a lower level, maybe something like 30 or 40% of GP consultations that were previously done face-to-face. It was lower than that before the pandemic. Maybe it will go up to 30 or 40% in that kind of way, but it will still reduce the number of face-to-face consultations that are necessary and important as well for certain conditions. But clearly, the sore throat or the runny nose is something that can be dealt with very much by a phone call, and many other things as well, where the patient, the person, the citizen, needs more advice and consultation rather than hands-on care. But I agree, the hands-on care, the personal face-to-face consultations with GPs, and of course consultants in hospital are very, very important as well. But they won't be at the same level that we saw before the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. So the numbers are rising really of people using this method.
Yes, absolutely right. And so therefore awareness is very important, accessibility, affordability of the technologies are very important, and the receptiveness of the health professionals and practitioners to dealing or having those kind of calls is important as well.
But I can also imagine it can feel a bit overwhelming for the doctors themselves, for the GPs, because it's a new method. It is quicker. It allows to perhaps manage more consultations, get more work done. And I don't want to compare with what we do, teaching online and stuff like that, meetings online, but it can feel overwhelming. So I suppose it can feel overwhelming for them as well.
I think you're right, it is overwhelming for many GPs and others who are used to doing things in a particular kind of way. And I know that there are some parallels between Czech Republic and UK in terms of recruitment and the numbers of GPs and nurses that are available. And so there are shortages, and which exacerbate, if you like, the pressures that GPs and others are under. I guess, as I say, things will settle back to a certain proportion of people who will consult remotely, but at the same time, the GPs and others will be then, by that point, used to this new way of communicating. The administrative systems will have been well embedded with the staff within the surgeries or within the hospital settings, so that they can organise it well with the patients and citizens who are out there as well. The patients and citizens will be used to the idea and will have the technologies, like simply through a mobile phone or a laptop, to make those connections. And for others, they will be getting used to the fact that their neighbour or their friend or their sister or brother is actually using these, and will gradually get the idea, well, actually, this is feasible, it works, and it means I don't have to catch 2 buses and a train to get to the hospital on every 2 months, because I can do a lot of stuff by phone. And then maybe once every 6 months, once a year, I could have that trip to the hospital for that outpatient appointment. Or I wouldn't have to go to the GP so often. And I could actually manage some of this myself by taking some of my measures, through a wristwatch or a worn device or online, taking the blood pressure and things like this. And I could manage myself a lot on that because I'd learned more about it, on my blood sugar levels. But where necessary, or if I felt it appropriate, that same set of information could go to clinicians or the doctor or the nurse, who would be able to make some judgments about my health and well-being, and perhaps phone me up or contact me and say, hello Malcolm, did you realise that your blood sugar levels were very high yesterday or earlier today or whatever, and is there an explanation for that? And it's that kind of dialogue that may follow up on the basis of, how do I put it, abnormal measures outside certain parameters, which could be noted by people who might be monitoring people's health. But at the same time, I'm not assuming that monitoring would take place, because the same kind of technologies can empower the patient, the individual, to manage for themselves and to decide actually when they want to share that information with the clinicians and others.
It all sounds very practical, and also it sounds like there is a huge tendency to really reshape the hierarchies existing in the system, which is interesting, and hopefully this is a new way that's going to prevail. But what's actually the length of their life to the homes of those in need?
That's an interesting question, because in practice the distance from me or you as a researcher and someone who's got an inquiring mind about the use of technologies in new ways, to actually the people who might be concerned, worried, anxious, or uncertain about the merits of those technologies and the way that they could use them in their homes is a very short distance, because most of us have families with elderly relatives. And clearly that's something for us to perhaps talk with them about and find, maybe to our surprise sometimes, that they are actually more in tune with some of these agendas than we actually think. And this comes back to the whole point about ageism and negative views of older people. It is so insidious in a way that it undermines the way that we think about policies, practices, innovation, technological, the implementation or provision of technologies and things like this.
So I can see that there is a space for sociologists, because there seems to be a lot of prejudice going on against older people.
Well, there is that, most certainly, but it's kind of insidious in even some of the jokes that we might share with each other. You know, all these sayings that we might share. You know, you can't teach an old dog new tricks and things like this, which I know translates into Czech, by the way. So yeah, there is this negative view, or older people being over the hill once they've retired, or they've passed some kind of chronological marker. I mean, I'm 71 now, and I get a little bit angry actually about some of the generalizations that are made about older people, because many clinicians see sicker older people, of course, by definition. It's what they do, it's their job. Yet 10% to 20% of older people perhaps could be classified as dependent in some kind of way. I mean, we all depend to some extent on our family and friends and so forth, but dependent in the sense that there are specific health conditions which they have difficulty in managing. But many others have a number of longer-term health conditions which they manage perfectly well, thank you very much. So if I come back to something I said earlier, where there are people who are fearful of this tsunami of older people who are very, very dependent, and they may come out with some figures based on all sorts of things like diabetes and high blood pressure and a lot of other things. And so many of these things are managed perfectly well by older people, by younger people as well. That the assumptions that this leads to dependency in a way that's going to create huge costs for health services is simply incorrect, provided that we can encourage and motivate people to manage their health in new kinds of ways and enable them to access the technologies that can help them to do that. So education, information, all parts of this, including for younger people, because of the growing issues that we are facing now about poor diet, poor lifestyles, obesity, diabetes, and things like this, because they are the things that may store up some big problems for us in the future, as far as health in the well-being and the clinical senses is concerned, and could increase our costs. I suppose underpinning what I'm saying is, look, I do support the use of technologies, but I do believe there's an obligation on all of our parts to adopt better lifestyles and to look after our own health better.
Throughout our lives.
Throughout our lives. And we cannot assume that any kind of national public sector funded health service is going to provide for us, except in some important circumstances for unanticipated diseases or illnesses that certainly couldn't have been foreseen by any of us individually. And it does mean that we've got to have more knowledge about our health, we've got to have more knowledge about some particular conditions with which we might be confronted in our latter years, like things around arthritis and things like this, that are fairly commonplace, or even learning about dementia as well, which is a particular and a particularly difficult challenge, but one which, again, technologies can help us with, and to help people live independently without having to think of them having to move to some kind of other special form of accommodation.
So it is all about thinking out of the box, right? Not only in academia, but also in real life, in everyday life of ours. Yeah.
And sociologically, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's plenty of work in the sociological field around age, ageism, and different models of aging, if you like. And there are some which are very negative about older age, and which portray dependency in a way that some people would find fairly revolting, if I'm honest about it, because of some of the associations of very dependent old age with incontinence and death and things like this. But again, we just have to remember that is a minority. None of us particularly want to go there in our own lives. But if we do manage our health better, hopefully we will find our way moving towards that holy grail of healthcare, which is compressed morbidity, whereby we live healthy lives up to a certain point, and the length of time we live less healthy lives, where we need support, is minimized.
Mm-hmm. Let's hope for that in every individual case, right? Well, undoubtedly there is a political dimension to all of this, and you've got a lot of experience on the international and governmental level too. How difficult is it to bring these topics, these issues to the political debate and to make it a political priority to implement the research outputs to the political programs?
That's not an easy question. Well, the easiest part of it is to refer to the fact that because we live in still a fairly ageist society, then it's a major problem to change the minds or the thinking of quite a large number of people who are in the political sphere, if you like. But the important thing is, and I will give credit to the European Union on this, that they have a fairly strong ethical perspective, if you like, on aging, on independence, on the use of technologies as well, in the programs they have on active and assisted living and things like this. And that I'm optimistic that gradually, not quickly enough, but gradually, mindsets will change to ones which are more positive about older people, and they are more inclusive in the sense that older people will not be categorized so readily as aging and therefore dependent, but will be seen in the same way as all people, which in itself is a more inclusive perspective.
It's more about redefining the what you wanted to avoid, but the function, right, of this group, this social group.
Yes, and for many, many decades, for instance, like with social alarms and telecare, the notion of having something around your neck that you push a button has been rejected by a lot of older people. But the good thing about those simple devices was that you could take this off and you could put it in the drawer, and you didn't have to use it. Of course, the people who provided the services wanted you to use them, but this was a gesture of your control. With some of the systems now, and we could talk about, for instance, the Internet of Things and smart homes as well, then this notion that you have embedded sensors and worn sensors monitoring your every meal that you take, every time you go to the toilet and everything else, is kind of crazy, because it is so intrusive.
Trusted is like to many people, and I understand. You have to find the right balance to all of this.
And that's why I point to control being so important. Configurable technologies is what's needed here, so that me, as a perhaps older person becoming more vulnerable, I can make some choices about how I want to be monitored. And this may sound a little bit facetious, but I've said that maybe to know that Mrs. Schmidt or whoever is well on a particular morning, all we need to know is if she has fed the cat, or if she has put the kettle on. So a single measure might be enough. And I might, as an older, frail person, say, yeah, that's okay. I have 2 daughters. I'd like them to know that I'm okay. So if I haven't put the kettle on by 8:30 in the morning, they would know about that, and they may well give me a call on the phone. And I'd say, yeah, I'm fine. I just had a bit of a lie and I watched a late film or whatever it was. But that would be a reflection of them respecting my right to have control over the extent of monitoring that is taking place and the extent to which they, as my relatives and family, are involved. Some clinicians talk about wraparound care, and that includes social care as well, where clearly they talk about, the option for 40 or more different sensors around your home. Now, that is definitely wraparound, but it's also suffocating, if you ask me, with regard to the amount of information that could be gathered. Okay, it has a benefit in terms of maybe the immediacy of a response if there was something that went wrong, but it may not fit with my notion of what I want.
Privacy.
Privacy, that's right.
Well, still I wonder, this all seems to have very positive or
could have very positive output, but it's still challenging to me to imagine all the doctors, to lose their elite status, and try to be more equal with the clients or with the ordinary people. Does that work well?
I don't think that they would lose their status. I think there is an increased role, by the way, for the likes of nurses and occupational therapists and others, because more and more nurses can now diagnose and prescribe and things like this. So they are, to some extent, moving into the territory that was occupied by doctors. I think that's fine. Because nurses still command a lot of respect. Now, sometimes they can be rather patronising and so forth, but nevertheless, a change in mindset, bearing in mind technologies, is important to nurses as well. And I did publish a paper, by the way, on the use of cameras, for instance, in care homes, where I was expecting to be attacked by the nursing profession, but they didn't, because there are some aspects of nursing care that do rely on observation. And so it's conceivable that cameras can be part of the means of observation. Now, only in certain special circumstances. And I was putting forward the notion of blind cameras, in a sense, that would gather data which no one would see unless there was some cause to revisit that data to bring together a picture which would show what actually happened in the circumstances where there was some concern. And with regard to doctors and their role, I see them as having a crucial management, coordination, and diagnostic role that is based on information that might be gathered directly by themselves in direct consultations. It might be gathered by nurses. It might be gathered by the technologies that person wears or has in their home. So they would have, if you like, a trilogy of sources of information, the nurses and other staff, by the way, that they would have with their specialist abilities. So they have this trilogy of sources of information, and they would still be able to make their judgments. And it wouldn't be down to the machine alone, it wouldn't be down to the nursing staff or the OT, the occupational therapists alone. It wouldn't be down to them alone. It would be something that took account of all their views, all the information gathered, and you, the patient, what your feelings were about the options concerned. So still, I think, a fairly crucial role for a GP. I hope so, because the notion of a GP is so traditional in our communities that I still value my own GP, for instance, and the ability to actually meet directly with her on different topics, which I think I would always prefer to talk to her about, rather than put it in some kind of digital systems or an email or something like that.
What are the current challenges of all this approach of digital health that you deal with? If you could pinpoint some of the greatest challenges that are there.
The quickest answer is a one-word answer, actually, and that's time. Because we need transformation more quickly than it is happening. Now, it may be that we do get to some kind of tipping point, in the words of another Malcolm Gladwell, where more and more people, you and me and others, are accessing services in new ways. So the health services simply have to respond to that in new ways, or finally give in, trying to defend the indefensible with regard to the old systems that they operate. So I think it may well be a matter for us to choose, if you like, where we go as the GP, or which GPs are offering the kind of flexibility that we would like to fit with our requirements, possibly because you're working, so actually getting to the doctor's surgery on a Tuesday afternoon or something is just simply not feasible. Anyway,
so open-minded people.
Sorry?
You're in need to find open-minded people.
Yeah, but also who are more confident and adept with the new technologies. So more flexibility, responding to what clearly the public wants, and actually some of them will lose business anyway. I mean, the public sector services, faced with competition from private sector services that very often are relatively low cost, you may find that people are actually voting with their mobile phones or their feet to access services that are available more on the private sector. And it is something that we need to watch very carefully about large, very often international global organizations like Amazon and people like that who are coming into this sector and who are promising to be able to respond to people's health queries very, very quickly indeed, in a way that maybe you wouldn't be able to get from your local health services and so forth. Now, this is just being tried out in the United States at the moment, but if it works, you can bet your life that there'll be similar models to be rolled out in European countries as well, and which could, what's the right word, create a kind of shake-up, if you like, in public sector health services. Now, what that shake-up will result in, I'm not sure, because there's always the possibility, as governments try to change money, that they will contract out some services to private sector bodies. And therein, by the way, lies a whole other question about our personal data as well. How safe our personal data is when we do interact with some of these technologies.
Mm-hmm. Well, another point I would say again is the social inclusion that's necessary for the older people, and perhaps what you already mentioned as well, the missing material resources of those people. If they don't have access to the technologies, well, how can they make use of it? So how can we challenge that? Or is it in the area of your interest as well?
It's in the area of my interest. I don't know quite how to challenge it, because maybe the traditional approach to the deprivation that is evident within certain geographical areas, sometimes within certain population groups as well, it usually can be defined reasonably easily where that deprivation lies, and potentially there's more investment in that area, more resources given to that area in order to overcome the problems that they face. Now, my worry about our digital networks is that deprivation could become more dispersed and therefore more hidden.
Mm-hmm.
And because governments and others will be able to say, well, the networks are there, people can access them if they want, but but drawing a veil, if you like, over the fact that, as you pointed out, they may not be able to afford, they may not be able to use. I mean, with regard to design, it's not just, and cost, it's not just a question of the suitability of the design. If you have a visual impairment and you have dexterity problems or hearing or sight problems, then clearly you are going to be disadvantaged with regard to these systems.
Mm-hmm.
That again is why Alexa is so attractive. If you can speak, then goodness me, that opens up a whole new world for many, many people.
Mm-hmm. Right. We should also mention you've got a book coming in 2022, and that will address what you described as a telegraph paradigm with Palgrave Macmillan. What can we look forward to? What are the current developments?
Yes. Well, I look forward to making more progress with the book, it has to be said, and very much hope that it will be published in the middle of 2022. And the clue is in the title, really, the telehealth paradigm. I do believe we're at a time where there is a paradigm shift taking place. And it's not a paradigm shift because of the technologies themselves, although they are an underlying reason why there is a paradigm shift. It's actually the change in attitudes, our attitudes towards technologies and the way we use them. Now, I haven't got all the answers yet, and I've touched on it a couple of times already, because there are some real concerns about the mega corporations and the gathering of our data and the privacy of that data and so forth. But if we can resolve those issues, we can provide people, you and me, with the right kind of security for our data. And this is not just our health data, it's about our activity levels and things like this, a whole lot more of our data. If we can secure that and convince us absolutely cast iron rules or frameworks within which we know that data is going to be safe, I think we can bring in that essential element of trust, which is so often missing with some of the systems that we work with at the moment. Some of the social media organizations, the trust bit is not there. Now, we get a lot of benefits, of course, from social media and all the rest of it. It is for free, and as you know, it's the added value that they get from our personal data, which they can then market to other people, that makes our data vulnerable. And even in the world of genomics, by the way, of course, you've got things like having your genome sequence tested and things like this. And some of the organizations that are offering that service now have been found to be selling that personal data to other organizations who who want to use it to market different things for you. So there's a number of areas that need to be, where the safeguards need to be in place. Another tick in the box, I think, for the European Commission, because they are working on this, and there's legislation on artificial intelligence and things like this that's coming through. But again, it's a matter of time. These things will take time to get onto the statute books, and it will then take a further amount of time before appropriate action can be taken at an appropriate scale to actually rein in, to control some of these big corporations who are dealing with the data that we are now vulnerable to losing to them. Now,
I have to ask now, are we running late or are we behind the technological advancement with our social reactions and solutions?
Yes, and yes. Absolutely. We are behind.
What can we do about it? How can we speed up if you say time is the problem? Is it by using the technology?
Well, I think, okay, we as academics can only do so much. But of course, there's a time lag between also what we think and what we say and what we write and what we publish. But I guess maybe there's something we should be doing more. And now, maybe this doesn't sit comfortably, perhaps, with academia, but maybe we should be trying to influence government agendas more strongly than we are. So, of course, not on a partisan kind of basis, but maybe we should be trying to engage more in the kind of all-party forums that exist in different countries that bring together people from different political persuasions and actually forcing our way somehow onto their agenda in order for them to reconsider the ways in which things are developing or should develop, in the knowledge that they will be faced by a number of lobbying groups who actually want to defend the status quo. For instance, they want to keep the status of doctors, they want to keep existing patterns of consultation, they want sometimes to favour some of the large companies who are looking to profiteer from developing technologies and from systems working in a particular kind of way. So I guess that the political agenda is one which perhaps academia should grapple with more vigorously than has been the case in the past, to individual nations, governments, European Union as well, or maybe who I think are doing reasonably well on this. But clearly we want to make sure that the content of legislation that they bring out that will be adopted then in the member states is going to be strong enough to actually enable individual governments to put the controls on some of the mega corporations and to also provide, what's the right word, a safeguard for us as individuals with regard to our personal data. There is, by the way, just a little side agenda here which I will mention, and that is about the ownership of that data. And all the evidence that I've seen so far is that once that data, after we have entrusted our data with the health services, once health services release that data, and there's some kind of added value based on the analysis of that data, then the ownership that we originally had, or we can originally argue that we had about our personal data, our personal health data, is lost. We lose that ownership as soon as there's some kind of added value attributed by, albeit by any corporation, whether it's private or public sector. And that is an issue of concern.
And anonymity is secure.
Yeah, well, and anonymity may not be secure, that's the point. So we want to make sure that that anonymity does remain there, except, I will make an allowance for this, except in exceptional circumstances, if there's some kind of public health emergency or something like this, where it is necessary to identify people in a particular town.
Such as now, perhaps?
Such as now, in the early stages now, yes, that, you're absolutely right, with the outbreak in China and what have you. It could have been that there is health data that would have enabled the pinpointing of the origin of the particular outbreak of that virus. Quite what they would have done about it, I'm not sure.
But it's also the question that is very present now, which is identifying the not unvaccinated.
Yes. So. Yes, again, so also privacy issues as well there. But you're right. And I think, and this may sound a little bit authoritarian, that again there may be special circumstances where it is essential that you're able to identify those people in order for the protection for a wider range of people as well.
Would you vote for identifying these people at the moment?
In the UK, there is legislation going through, or regulation going through, that means that all nursing and care staff who are directly face-to-face with people who are vulnerable need to have double vaccinations. I think I don't know quite sure how, I don't know, I haven't thought it through yet, to be honest with you, but I think I would err on the side of certainly regulations being in place where people are directly in contact with vulnerable people, like I just said, but perhaps more broadly there are some, the broader agenda of our personal privacy I think needs somehow to be maintained and safeguarded. So I don't think I would vote for it, wholesale identification of people who haven't been vaccinated.
Okay. Well, let's also meditate over this call for more political engagement of the academia in these questions. Well, thank you, Malcolm, very much for your time and for an interesting interview. I would like to also invite all our students to enter your course on digital health and the impact on health and care services. So please find the course in Stack and get engaged with these topics which are very interesting and necessary to discuss indeed. Thank you very much, Malcolm.
Well, thank you very much, Petra. It's been a delight to talk with you.
Thank you.